I never questioned my father's stories until the day I found his death certificate, dated 3 years before I was born. My name is Chen, and for 32 years I believed I had the most fascinating father in the world. Robert Chen was everything you'd want in a dad. A decorated war veteran, a successful businessman, and a devoted family man who never missed a school play or soccer game. He told incredible stories about his time in Vietnam, his rise from poverty to wealth, and the day he met my mother in a small cafe in San Francisco. But Robert Chen died on March 15, 1987. I was born on June 3, 1990. The discovery came by accident. I was helping my mother, Linda, clean out our old family home after she decided to move to a retirement community. We were going through a box of legal documents when I found it, a yellow death certificate with my father's name, social security number, and date of birth. Everything matched perfectly except for that impossible date of death. "Mom," I called out, my hands trembling as I held the document. "What is this?" She appeared in the doorway, took one look at the paper in my hands, and collapsed into the nearest chair. The color drained from her face as if I'd just shown her a ghost. In a way, I suppose I had. "I can explain," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. For the next hour, I sat in stunned silence as my mother unraveled 32 years of my life. The man I called father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding, who held my children when they were born, had been dead for years before I even existed. Then who? I couldn't even finish the question. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, sweetheart. I honestly don't know." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the family photos, all the memories, all the conversations. How do you process the fact that your entire life has been built around someone who couldn't possibly exist? I pulled out photo albums and stared at pictures of my father, or whoever he was, holding me as a baby, teaching me to swim, celebrating birthdays and holidays. The man in those photos looked exactly like Robert Chen. Same smile, same laugh lines, same distinctive scar on his left hand from what he'd told me was a childhood accident. But Robert Chen was dead. So who was this man who had raised me? I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. I had no idea that this investigation would lead me down a rabbit hole so deep and disturbing that I would question not just my father's identity, but the very nature of reality itself. The next morning, I called in sick to work and began what would become the most important investigation of my life. I started with the basics: death records, birth certificates, military service records. What I found was both confirming and terrifying. Robert Chen had indeed died in 1987, 3 years before my birth. His military records were authentic, his business dealings were real, and his death had been properly documented and witnessed. Yet somehow, impossibly, he had continued to live, to love, and to be my father for over 3 decades after his death. 3 weeks into my investigation, I had compiled enough evidence to prove that my father was dead, and enough evidence to prove that he was very much alive. The contradiction was driving me insane. I sat in my home office, surrounded by documents that painted an impossible picture. On one side of my desk, Robert Chen's death certificate, autopsy report, funeral home records, and even newspaper clippings about his funeral. On the other side, decades of financial records, tax returns, medical records, and legal documents, all bearing his signature, all dated after his supposed death. The paper trail was extensive and consistent. After 1987, Robert Chen had continued to file taxes, renew his driver's license, receive medical care, and conduct business. Bank records showed regular deposits and withdrawals. Insurance companies had paid claims. The IRS had conducted an audit in 1995 and found everything in order. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Rodriguez to help me make sense of the impossible. Marcus had 20 years of experience in fraud investigation, but when I showed him the evidence, he just stared at the documents for a long time before speaking. "Sarah, in all my years doing this work, I've never seen anything like this," he said, rubbing his temples. "Either someone created the most elaborate and flawless identity theft in history, or..." He trailed off. "Or what? Or we're dealing with something that shouldn't be possible." Marcus began his own investigation, approaching it from a different angle. He interviewed neighbors who remembered my father, tracked down business associates, and even spoke with doctors who had treated him. Everyone remembered Robert Chen. Everyone had clear, detailed memories of interactions with him after 1987. But Marcus also uncovered something disturbing. No one could remember Robert Chen from before 1987. Despite his supposed decades of life and business dealings, no one had any memories of him prior to the year he had allegedly died. It's like he just appeared in 1987, Marcus told me during one of our meetings. Born fully formed as a 45-year-old man with a complete history that no one actually remembered living through. The breakthrough came when Marcus tracked down Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, the physician who had signed Robert Chen's death certificate. She was retired now, living in a small town in Oregon, but she remembered the case clearly. It was unusual, Dr. Harrison told us over coffee in her kitchen. Mr. Chen died of a heart attack, very sudden, very clear-cut. But there was something odd about the whole situation. Odd how? I asked. Well, for one thing, no family came to claim the body. His wife, your mother, never showed up to the hospital or the funeral home. We tried to reach her for weeks, but she seemed to have just disappeared. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to the body? That's the strange part. 3 days after the funeral, the cemetery called to report that the grave had been disturbed. When they investigated, they found the casket empty. We assumed it was grave robbers, but nothing was taken. The casket was intact, just empty. Marcus and I exchanged glances. An empty grave and a man who continued to live after death. The pieces of an impossible puzzle were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. Dr. Harrison continued, there was something else. I kept the file all these years because it bothered me. Mr. Chen's medical records from before his death show some anomalies I've never seen before or since. She retrieved a manila folder from a cabinet and spread the contents across her kitchen table. The medical records showed standard information: height, weight, blood type, but there were notes in the margins that made my blood run cold. Patient exhibits unusual cellular regeneration, one note read. Tissue samples show properties inconsistent with normal human physiology. Another note, dated just days before his death. Patient's condition appears to be deteriorating rapidly. Cellular structure becoming increasingly unstable. What does this mean? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dr. Harrison looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and fear. Honestly, I don't know. But I've been a doctor for 40 years and I've never seen anything like it. It was as if your father wasn't quite human. Armed with Dr. Harrison's medical records and a growing sense of dread, I decided to confront my mother directly. I couldn't continue this investigation without understanding her role in whatever impossible scenario was unfolding. I found her in her new apartment, unpacking boxes and trying to create a normal life. When I walked in with a folder full of evidence, she took one look at my face and sank into her chair. You found out more, didn't you? She said quietly. Mom, I need the truth. All of it. I know Dad died in 1987, and I know you disappeared around the same time. What happened during those missing years? For a moment she just stared at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I met him in 1983, she began. Robert was everything I'd ever dreamed of: handsome, successful, charming. We had a whirlwind romance and married within 6 months. But almost immediately, I noticed things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? He never aged. In 4 years of marriage he looked exactly the same. He never got sick, never seemed to need much sleep. His body temperature was always slightly lower than normal. And his eyes. She shuddered. Sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes would be completely different. Older. Ancient almost. I felt my heart pounding as she continued. Then there were the gaps in his memory. He could tell elaborate stories about his childhood and his time in the war, but if I asked about specific details or dates, he'd get confused. It was like he'd memorized a script but didn't actually remember living through any of it. Why didn't you leave? I tried. In early 1987 I started planning to leave him. I was scared, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. Then one night he came home looking different. Older somehow, and tired in a way I'd never seen before. My mother stood up and walked to the window, staring out at nothing. He told me he was dying. That his body was finally giving out after years of fighting against something he called the deterioration. He said he had maybe weeks left, and he asked me to stay with him until the end. And you did? Yes. I watched him decline rapidly over the next few weeks. It was horrible, Sarah. He would have these episodes where he'd seem to forget who he was entirely. He'd speak in different voices, tell stories that contradicted each other, sometimes even speak in languages I'd never heard him use before. The pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture, but I needed to hear the rest. When he died, my mother continued, I couldn't handle it. I left town immediately. I drove across the country and tried to start over. For 3 years I lived under a different name, working odd jobs and trying to forget everything that had happened. But then you came back. In 1990, yes. I don't know why. I felt drawn back to our old house. When I arrived, he was there waiting for me. Robert. Looking exactly the same as the day I'd left, as if he'd never died at all. I felt the room spinning around me. What did he say? He said he'd been waiting for me. That he knew I'd come back. He acted like nothing had happened, like he'd never died, like I'd never left. When I tried to talk about it, he seemed genuinely confused. As far as he was concerned, we'd been together the whole time. And you just accepted it? My mother turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. What choice did I have? The man I loved was back somehow. And then I found out I was pregnant. You were conceived that first night I returned. How do you walk away from that? For the next hour she told me about the years that followed. How Robert had been the perfect husband and father, how he'd never aged, never gotten sick, never seemed to need much sleep. How sometimes she'd catch him staring at old photographs with a confused expression, as if he was trying to remember a life that wasn't quite his. He loved you so much, Sarah, she said. Whatever he was, wherever he came from, his love for you was real. I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at you. But there was one more thing she needed to tell me, something that made my blood run cold. Last month, before we started packing up the house, I noticed he was starting to look tired again. The same way he looked before he died the first time. I think it's happening again. The revelation that my father might be dying again, for the second time, sent me into a panic. I raced home to find him exactly where he always was in the evenings. In his study, reading a book by the fireplace. But my mother was right. He looked different. Tired. Fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Dad, I said, sitting down across from him. We need to talk. He looked up from his book, a biography of Winston Churchill that I'd seen him read dozens of times, and smiled. But the smile seemed forced, weary. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? I had prepared for this conversation, but now that I was facing him, I didn't know how to begin. How do you ask your father if he's actually dead? How do you confront someone about an existence that shouldn't be possible? I've been doing some research into our family history, I said carefully. I found some confusing documents. His expression didn't change, but I noticed his grip tighten on the book. What kind of documents? I pulled out the death certificate and placed it on the table between us. For a long moment he just stared at it. Then to my surprise he began to laugh. Not the warm, familiar laugh I knew, but something hollow and sad. You found it, he said quietly. I always wondered when this day would come. Dad, what's going on? Who are you really? He set down his book and looked into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. I don't know, Sarah. I wish I could give you a simple answer, but the truth is, I don't understand it myself. For the next 2 hours, my father told me a story that challenged everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of existence itself. I remember dying, he said. I remember the heart attack, the pain, the gradual fading of consciousness. I remember a profound sense of peace, and then nothing. But somehow, I also remember waking up 3 years later in our old house, with complete memories of a life I'm not sure I actually lived. What do you mean? The memories feel real, but they're inconsistent. I remember my childhood, but the details change sometimes. I remember the war, but when I try to recall specific battles or people, the memories slip away like water. It's as if someone took fragments of a real person's life and used them to construct something that could pass for human. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. I studied my father's face, the face I'd known and loved my entire life, and tried to process what he was telling me. Do you remember the 3 years between your death and when Mom came back? No. There's just emptiness. Like I didn't exist during that time. But you came back when she returned. Why? I think, he said slowly, I exist because she needed me to exist. Because you needed a father. Love is a powerful force, Sarah. Maybe powerful enough to call back something that was already gone. As we talked through the night, I began to understand the true tragedy of our situation. My father, whatever he was trapped in an existence he didn't fully understand, living a life that felt real but might be nothing more than an elaborate construction of memory and need. "Am I even really your father?" he asked at one point, and the pain in his voice was heartbreaking. "You raised me," I said firmly. "You loved me, taught me, protected me. If that doesn't make you my father, then nothing does." But even as I said the words, I could see the deterioration my mother had mentioned. Throughout our conversation he seemed to fade a little more, as if the act of acknowledging the truth was somehow draining his strength. "It's starting again, isn't it?" I asked. He nodded sadly. "I can feel it. The same sensation I remember from before, like I'm coming apart at the seams. I think my time is almost up." "How long?" "Days, maybe weeks. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wish I could give you a normal father, a normal family, a normal explanation for all of this." I reached across and took his hand. It felt cold, somehow less substantial than before. "I don't need normal," I said. "I just need you to know that you were loved. Or loved. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, you were the best father I could have asked for." Tears rolled down his face as he squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more to me than you could ever know." My father died for the second time on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 35 years after his first death. I was with him when it happened, holding his hand as his breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. This time there was no confusion, no mystery about what was happening. We both knew it was the end. But the story didn't end there. 3 days after the funeral, I received a phone call that would finally provide the answers I'd been searching for. The caller identified himself as Dr. James Morrison, a researcher at a private facility that studied what he called anomalous phenomena. "Ms. Chen," he said, "I understand you've been investigating some unusual circumstances surrounding your father's death and subsequent existence. How do you know about that? We've been monitoring your father's case for over 30 years. Would you be willing to meet with me? I think I can provide some answers." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet Dr. Morrison at his facility outside the city. What I found there defied all logic and reason, but finally explained the impossible truth about my father. The facility was part laboratory, part archive, filled with documents and specimens that seemed to come from another world entirely. Dr. Morrison led me to a conference room where he spread out a file that was easily 6 inches thick. "Your father was part of an experiment," he began without preamble. "Not by us, but by something we don't fully understand. In 1987, Robert Chen died exactly as the records indicate. But his death occurred at the same time as what we call a consciousness transfer event." "A what?" "Think of it as a backup copy of a person's mind and memories being downloaded into a new container. We believe there are entities from somewhere else, another dimension, another reality, that occasionally perform these transfers for purposes we can only speculate about." Dr. Morrison showed me photographs and documents that made my head spin. Images of people who had died and later returned, families who had lived for decades with loved ones who shouldn't exist, children born to parents who had been dead for years. "The transfers aren't perfect," he continued. "The memories are often incomplete or inconsistent. The physical forms are temporary. They typically last between 20 and 40 years before deteriorating. And they seem to be sustained primarily by the emotional bonds they form with living people." "You're saying my father was some kind of alien experiment?" "Not exactly. You think it's more like conservation. Preservation of human consciousness by entities that value what we are but don't fully understand how we work. Your father's consciousness was preserved and placed in a form that could continue to exist, to love, to be loved." I thought about all the inconsistencies I'd noticed over the years, the gaps in his memory, the way he never aged, the strange medical readings Dr. Harrison had documented. Why my father? Why us? We don't know. The selection process appears random. But we do know that these transferred consciousnesses seem to be drawn to complete unfinished business, particularly around family and love. Dr. Morrison pulled out another document, this one stamped with official-looking seals. "Your father wasn't the first in your family, Sarah. According to our records, this has happened before." The document he handed me was a birth certificate, mine. But there was something strange about it. In the section for father's name, someone had made a correction. The original entry had been crossed out and replaced with Robert Chen. What was the original name? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Unknown, Dr. Morrison said quietly. Your biological father's identity was never recorded. Your mother was 3 months pregnant when she returned to town in 1990, but she had been alone for the entire 3 years she was away. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying? We believe your conception was part of the same process that brought your father back. A way to anchor his consciousness in the world through a genetic connection that shouldn't have been possible. I stared at the document, trying to process what I was being told. Not only was my father not entirely human, but my very existence was part of whatever impossible process had created him. What am I? I whispered. You're human, Sarah. Completely, perfectly human. But you're also something more, a bridge between what your father was and what he became. His love for you and yours for him is what kept him stable for over 30 years. As I sat in that sterile conference room surrounded by evidence of impossible things, I finally understood the true nature of my family. We had been held together not by blood or biology, but by something far more powerful and mysterious, love that transcended death itself. Dr. Morrison walked me to the door as our meeting concluded. There's one more thing you should know, he said. These consciousness transfers, they sometimes have children who carry certain abilities. Enhanced intuition, unusual healing properties, sometimes even the ability to sense when these transfers are occurring in others. Are you saying I might have inherited something from him? It's possible. We'd like to study you if you're willing. Not as a test subject, but as a partner in understanding what we're dealing with. I looked back at the facility, then at the world beyond it, a world where my impossible father had loved me for 32 years despite being dead for 35. I'll think about it, I said. As I drove home that evening, I realized that learning the truth hadn't diminished my love for my father or made our relationship feel less real. If anything, it had shown me that love itself might be the most powerful force in the universe, strong enough to call back the dead, to create life where none should exist, and to build a family from the fragments of impossible dreams. My father may never have existed in the way most people understand existence. But he had been real in every way that mattered. And that truth, strange and impossible as it was enough for me. The father who never existed had given me the most real childhood anyone could ask for. And maybe, in a universe full of impossible things, that's exactly what love is supposed to do.